this. And it was then, when he came out, he was elected to Parliament and appointed a government minister, and he was Tibet's greatest friend in India. And Lodi was writing to him to share a concern that Lodi had, and Lodi shared with me. He apologized for sounding a little bit revolutionary in the letter, but he was young at the time. I think he was 31 when he wrote this letter. And he talked about what he thought was a crisis in the Tibetan movement, where there was an attitude of defeatism, he said, and apathy and timidity, which was undermining the Dalai Lama's vision and his work. And he was looking to how to correct that, and he was writing to George, first of all, to let him know that he thought that India offered an example for the Tibetan nation as to how to be governed in a way that was both democratic but also spiritually inspiring. He mentioned a number of Indian leaders who characterized that, including Mahatma Gandhi and others. And he told George that he wanted to establish a democratic studies center that would train a new generation of Tibetan leaders, and he asked George to bless this initiative and then to help him recruit Indian figures to associate themselves with it. And as we know, in the years that followed, Lodi played a very central role in strengthening and modernizing the Tibetan movement in accordance with the vision that he had conveyed to George in that letter. And in 1990, as I noted, he brought his vision and political skills to the United States, where he helped create the International Campaign for Tibet and built a powerful base of support in the U.S. Congress, all the while conducting 9 rounds of negotiations with the Chinese over the status of Tibet. The position of Tibet on the international stage is vastly stronger, in my view, than it was 4 decades ago when Lodi wrote that letter to George. The Dalai Lama is now a global leader. Arguably, he is the world's preeminent moral voice. I really think that's true today. He and Václav Havel together represented that, but with the death of Václav Havel and also Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama is really the preeminent moral voice in the world today. And of course, you now have, as Jonathan pointed out, the Tibet Policy Act that was passed in 2002, a major piece of legislation. More recently, the Reciprocity Act and a lot of other pieces of legislation. And you have support for Tibet growing internationally. We have parliamentarians here from so many countries. The session that Michael Danby led so well yesterday involved 9 parliamentarians from 9 different countries. We have 2 more here today. And this really reflects, I think, the broad support, and also, as Jonathan pointed out, the support in the United States is bipartisan, because Tibet represents this unusual issue where the difference between oppression and freedom is so clear that people on both sides of the political divide in the United States can unite around the support for Tibetan freedom and their dignity and their rights. Now, I'm aware that China is a rising global power today, and that Beijing uses its military and economic muscle to force other countries to bend obsequiously to its will and to accept its position on Tibet, even as it destroys the language, the culture, the identity, and the religion of the Tibetan people. And I think what they're doing in Tibet today, and as Matteo pointed out, it's actually in many ways growing worse, constitutes a crime against humanity under international law. And as we think about how to respond, we need to bear in mind that while Beijing is a strong and centralized and powerful dictatorship, it also has its vulnerabilities. Many China scholars, and we've published many of these articles in our Journal of Democracy, have called attention to the increasing evidence of the regime's decay, from the collapse of the ideology in the period after Mao's death to the erosion of the regime's performance-based legitimacy as economic growth has slowed to its lowest rate in 30 years. This is a regime that does not have political legitimacy, and the legitimacy is based upon its economic performance. There are also splits in the party leadership that are caused by Xi Jinping's radical centralization of power. And Xi told party officials earlier this year that the regime faces, and this is a quote, major risks on all fronts, and we must batten down the hatches. They were particularly worried in this year because of all the anniversaries, including, of course, the anniversary that's coming up of Tiananmen Square. And nowhere is the regime's fixation on survival more apparent than in the battle against what Xi Jinping calls historical nihilism, which involves forbidding any account of the past that diminishes the prestige of the Communist Party and the legitimacy of its monopoly on power. Examples include the suppression of public commemorations of the 60th anniversary of the famine caused by the Great Leap Forward, in which 30 to 40 million people perished, to the Cultural Revolution, which was a period of madness, ideological madness, in which 1 to 2 million people were killed, but also it damaged the whole society. And that's one of the reasons people were so happy to see Mao go in 1976. And of course, to the 30th anniversary now of the massacre at Tiananmen Square. One of the historians we've published in the journal, Glenn Tifford, has called the Tiananmen a source of an inner trauma for the regime, which remains fixated on the demise of the Soviet Union and dreads anything that is remotely similar to what it fearfully calls a color revolution. And those are the revolutions that occurred in Ukraine, in Georgia, and in Iran, the Green Revolution, and so forth. On no historical issue is the regime more vulnerable, in my view, than the history of its invasion, occupation, and annexation of Tibet. And when it rejected the Dalai Lama's middle way approach, which Lodi, as I noted, pursued through 9 rounds of negotiations with Beijing, the regime said that it wouldn't speak to His Holiness the Dalai Lama until he acknowledged that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. We've heard that. Now, Beijing's position on this issue is entirely groundless historically. And Michael Van Walt yesterday and his colleagues at Creta have spent almost a decade studying the history of Inner and East Asia, and they brought together 40 of the world's leading Tibet scholars on the region, and also international lawyers who specifically addressed the question of whether Tibet was ever historically a part of China. And the conclusions of this research that have been presented to this conference and will be presented internationally as we go forward, but this conference is I think, especially significant because the conclusions were first presented here, are unambiguous, unequivocal, absolutely categorical. Tibet was never a part of China at any time before China invaded Tibet in 1950. Beijing has not tried to prove otherwise, and because it cannot prove otherwise, it can only make declarations and assertions. And let's be clear, these statements are groundless. They are total lies. Now, Beijing's demand that His Holiness provide a patina of legitimacy for its aggression exposes Beijing's insecurity. Why would the conqueror demand not just the acquiescence of the conquered, but also its acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the conquest if it didn't know that without such an acknowledgement, the conquest has no legitimacy whatsoever? China knows that, yet it has brazenly put the issue of history on the table. As a result, I believe it is incumbent upon all people who believe that respect for international law is a precondition for peaceful relations among states to challenge the Chinese regime's blatant rewriting of history. We should look for every opportunity to raise this issue and to challenge the legitimacy of China's invasion and annexation of Tibet and of its continuing denial of the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. Scholars and international lawyers have now authoritatively rebuked the specious claim that Tibet has always been a part of China, and it is now the job of the Tibetan movement and its supporters among parliamentarians and human rights defenders to mobilize an international campaign defending Tibetan rights and identity based on historical truth and international law. This is a battle that George and Lodi would have loved to fight. And we'll have to do it now without them, but let their memory be our inspiration and our guide. I mean, we're in Latvia, which in 1970 was an oppressed nation occupied by the Soviet Union. You can go right nearby here and see they call it the Occupation Museum, but it was a nation that was oppressed just the way Tibet is today. And in 1970, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer, received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in his statement, he said something profoundly relevant to our discussion today. The key thing he said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he said, and think about China when I say this, he was thinking about the Soviet Union. But violence, he said, violence does not and cannot exist by itself. It is invariably intertwined with the lie. They are linked in the most intimate, the most organic and profound fashion. Violence cannot conceal itself behind anything except lies. And lies have nothing to maintain them save violence. Anyone who has once proclaimed violence as his method must inexorably choose the lie as his principle. This is especially true in the modern world, Solzhenitsyn said, because violence can no longer exist without veiling itself in a mist of lies, without concealing itself behind the sugary words of falsehood. No longer does violence always and necessarily lunge straight for your throat. More often than not, it demands of its subjects only that they pledge allegiance to lies, that they participate in the falsehood, which is exactly what Beijing has demanded of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The response, Solzhenitsyn said in his Nobel speech, should be clear: to defeat the lie, to defeat the lie. That is what we must strive to do. At stake is not just the fate of the people of Tibet, but the future also of world peace. Thank you.
You now understand why I said he's a legend. Not only because of obviously historical knowledge, but really for the passion that adds a lot to the institutional role that you play in the United States. Thank you, Carl. We now move to Europe, and I think as we go forward with the conversation, it could be also interesting to start talking about the transatlantic relationship on this issue and the kind of cooperation that could be established. And we will begin now with Saba Sogor. You have heard from him already yesterday, a member of parliament from Romania who has been heavily involved in the work at the European Parliament on Tibet for the last few years. Saba.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and I would like to speak first of all as a Hungarian minority member living in a post-communist country in the EU, and secondly as a member of the European Parliament for 12 years. As a Hungarian, my historical and cultural fondness towards Tibet started with the passion for Hungarian discoverers. One of the most respected travelers and scholars is Sándor Körösi de Csoma, the first European who have studied in Tibetan language and Buddhism, leaving behind him a cultural history research on Tibet of universal significance. In 1819, Csoma traveled on foot from Europe to the Himalayas in order to look for the ancestral homeland of the Hungarians. Despite his gigantic efforts, he never reached the homeland he searched for, but during his short stay in Tibet, of course, in the course of which he studied Tibetan language and literature, he nevertheless succeeded in writing the first scientifically significant Tibetan English dictionary and grammar. He was the true example of what seemingly impossible feats we can achieve if we set ourselves to it. But my affinity towards Tibetans is also due to another reason. I come from a part of Europe that across history has been many borders shifting above the heads of people who stayed in the same place. This is also the case of my region, Transylvania, which following the First World War was cut off from historical Hungary next to Romania. As a consequence of history now, we are autochthonous minority community of 1.3 million people, making great effort to preserve our identity, to use our mother tongue and use our symbols in a political climate that is sometimes very unfavorable to our aspirations. This is why I have such a great appreciation for the peaceful decade-long struggle for human rights, democracy, freedom, and autonomy of Tibetans. Despite the geographical distance and the difference in the degree of hostility and violence towards our minority communities, there are some underlying similarities between our experiences. In my Eastern European experience, there are many common traits in the way countries of the former Soviet bloc, now members of the EU, dealt with their ethnic minorities, both during communism as well as after the regime changes. The Romanian communist state has regarded its ethnic Hungarian citizens with suspicion and considered them a threat. Even today, there is a special department at the Romanian Secret Service which is dealing with the minorities, especially the Hungarian, the most numberable minority, the biggest one in numbers. As such, its main purpose was to assimilate them on the long term by denying them the right to speak and learn in their mother tongue, to have their own cultural institution, basically to be themselves. The communist authorities also used the country's industrialization program for ethnic homogenization, settling large groups of majority population in formal compact ethnic minority areas. It's very familiar, isn't it? All post-communist countries argue that the acceptance of multiculturalism and diversity may undermine the stability of the state. I would argue that, on the contrary, it is the oppression of diversity that undermines the social and political fabric of a society, not the other way around. Well-functioning, cohesive states can only exist if they are able to deal appropriately with diversity, and communities are strengthened when difference is recognized and valued. And secondly, as a member of the main representative body of citizens in the European Union, please allow me to make a brief outline of what we did in the Tibet issue during the last years to keep human rights abuses on the agenda, and my wishes on what the EU should do in the future. Of course, there are many maps committed to improve the human rights situation in China. However, these maps members of the European Parliament, face the same chilling political headwind from China as most governments across the globe, many of which are either silenced through investments or threats to cut economic ties. At any other time or in any other country, the human rights abuses we see today in China would have led to a global outcry. But the relative indifference of the world to the situation of ethnic and religious minorities in China is a sign of the position of power the Beijing government is in to stifle any criticism. As a result, there is a strong tendency towards auto-censor and to sweep human rights abuses under the carpet in the European Parliament as well. Not to mention that there are also a few members that behave as if acting in the interest of the Chinese government. The latter often organize conferences which paint a rosy picture of Tibet, where China is seen as a civilizing empire that educates people left in the dark by their religious leaders and lifts them out of poverty. It will also assume that it was this fear of Chinese punitive action which led to the fact that in this parliamentary term we could not get enough support from the members to establish the Tibet intergroup, because the Liberals and the Greens withdrew their support. Nevertheless, despite this setback, I believe that we had some notable achievements in our current 5 years mandate we can be proud of. we still organize regular meetings on Tibetan issues in the so-called Tibet Interest Group under the leadership of my colleague from Germany, Thomas Mann. And of course, with the invaluable support of the Tibet Office and the International Campaign for Tibet, we met each month to discuss human rights violation in Tibet and China and held hearings and debates on other matters of serious concerns such as environmental issues on the Tibetan plateau, elections and so on. In terms of content, on the level of the European Parliament, we also managed to pass 3 specific human rights resolutions concerning China. The first was on the case of human rights activists, sorry for my pronunciation, Wu Chen, Xi Yang, Li Ming Che, Tashi Wanchuk, and Tibetan monk Chokli. The second human rights resolution was on the case of the Larangar Tibetan Buddhist Academy and on Ilham Tohti. I will not enter in detail because I'm afraid my time is running out. I have, okay. And the third and the last such human rights resolution adopted just on the last plenary session of this mandate was on the situation of religious and ethnic minorities. It expressed a strong concern about the repressive regime that religious and ethnic minorities, in particular Uyghurs and Kazakhs, Tibetans and Kazakhs face, and called on Chinese authorities to respect fundamental freedoms. Besides this resolution focused on human rights issues, we also managed to insert concerns about Tibet in both of the 2 reports on EU-China relations of this mandate. Although these reports were meant to be rather focused on economic relations, we nevertheless succeeded in introducing a strong condemnation of the human rights situation in China, such as the Chinese Communist Party headline policies against the Tibetan people, including cases of torture, disappearance, and arbitrary detention, and the forceful resettlement of over 2 million Tibetan nomads and herders. Tibet also featured in the EP's annual human rights reports. On several successive occasions, the EP European Parliament called on the EU to rethink its human rights strategy vis-à-vis China in view of the lack of tangible results on the human rights dialogues. Such adopted papers were also complemented by individual activities of MEPs who organized a large number of conferences and exhibitions on the situation of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other religious and ethnic minorities. Of course, all these achievements wouldn't have been possible without the devoted work and strong support of the Brussels Tibet Office and the International Campaign for Tibet. And now, as a sort of conclusion, I would try to formulate some wishes and recommendations for the new European Parliament that will start its mandate in July after the elections. Seeing the ever more worrying human rights development in China, including the use of the most advanced state surveillance techniques in the world to suppress any dissent, raising a strong voice in defense of the oppressed is more important than ever. When asked about its human rights record, China aims to divert focus to social and economic development, pointing out all the money it pours into Tibet or other regions. Nevertheless, social economic rights are no more fundamental or important than civil and political rights. Economic development and human rights go together. It is only if the latter are respected that a human being can enjoy the fruits of social and economic progress. In general terms, I think that we Europeans should insist on this in our dealings with China. Although China is the 2nd largest economy in the world and Europe's 2nd largest trading partner, it is still an authoritarian state responsible for serious breaches of fundamental rights, including the freedom of expression, association, assembly, and religion. Europe needs an approach in which the pursuit of its trade and investment interests does not go against the principle it claims to stand for. It should not ignore the serious human rights violation in China and the mistreatment of ethnic minorities. Only by dealing with such matters can we build a credible and strong relation with China, one that is in the interest of both the EU and the population of China. This credibility can only be reinforced if it can set the best possible example of fundamental and minority rights on its territory. I'm convinced that if the Union wants to be a credible actor for human rights in the world, it has to start at home and show the best possible example abroad, including in the areas of its European autochthonous minorities. It must show the world that there are models for functional cohesion and economical developed societies in which minorities are not threats but strong assets. As a member of the European Parliament in the last 12 years, I was dealing also in the delegation of the ASEAN countries, and I always told to the colleagues, members of the European Parliament, state presidents, prime ministers, ministers, that don't look to the European Union as a model. We cannot be a model. We can be maybe just a source of inspiration. And don't follow the bad students of the 27 or 28. Follow the good ones. I will not mention the bad ones or the good ones, but on minority rights, Europe has to improve a little bit his standards, and that's the best way today to start a dialogue with China and to try to convince the Chinese authorities to behave, because if you are a world power, if you want to be a world power, you don't need to kill your own autochthonous people, and you don't need to destroy their culture to live in peace. I hope that China wants to be a real power, and they don't want to repeat what some European countries, or even the United States or other countries around the world did it in the past. But we Europeans, we gave a lot of bad examples to the world. My Indian fellows can tell also what they can thank to the British times. And it's in our common interest that new powers, new states like China should never repeat the mistakes what we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Saba. And we continue with talking about Europe, and after this we'll open up for discussion on the floor. Now the floor goes to Vincent Metten, who has been the EU Policy Director of the International Campaign for Tibet for the last at least 10 years, right? Yes. Please, Vincent.
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo, for your introduction. So I will try to complement what was just said by Csaba Sógor, who is a very strong supporter and ally in the European Parliament. I will try to give you a broader perspective on EU-China relations and put Tibet in this perspective also. My presentation will be divided into 3 parts. I will first present the EU-China architecture, then the division between member states when it comes to relations to China, and then I will speak about the recent developments that we notice in Europe. So the EU architecture with China is complicated, as you can see on this image. It is composed of 3 pillars. I will be synthetic. The political dialogue one, the economic dialogue, and the last one is the people-to-people dialogue. It's the last settled pillar. The second one, the economic, is the oldest one, and the political dialogue was in the middle, created. There are a lot of different actors, a lot of interlocutors in all these different structures. There are more than 50 different areas of cooperation with China in all sectors. One of the main problems is the mainstreaming of human rights into these different areas. Human rights are discussed, but in small boxes. And I would say that the 3 main areas or meetings where this discussion on human rights are taking place is, first one, the highest one, is the summit. There is once per year a summit between EU and China, between Donald Tusk, and on the counter side it's not Xi Jinping but the Prime Minister Li Keqiang, and recently Merkel asked if Xi Jinping could be the representative person for China. They had a meeting again in April. Human rights was discussed, but nothing really strong came out of it. And no individual cases were raised by Donald Tusk afterwards. Then we have in the political dialogue pillar, we have the high-level strategic dialogue with High Representative Mogherini, with her counterpart is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is also once per year. There is another box which is the most important one for us in this diagram, which is the human rights dialogue. There has been again a round of talk in this year on 1st and 2nd of April, and it was the 37th round of talk. And NGOs, our International Campaign for Tibet, are quite critical because we feel this dialogue, even if it's a channel of communication, are not really bringing any results and are not implemented on the ground in any way. It's a more lipstick exercise, and during the last one, again, it was seen as a difficult round from the EU side. The EU asked Mr. Gilmore, who is the new representative for human rights, to give some introductory addresses during the dialogue, and he did it and raised the universality of human rights. He's a former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland and also former Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I think that's a good message if he was there and also appeared politically. That's sending a message to the Chinese side. And in part of this dialogue is normally a meeting with civil society representatives, so NGO representative and the Chinese delegation. But China rejected to attend this meeting, so it took place, but without the Chinese participation. So it was a little bit a strange format, and ICT with FIDH's hat was in the room, but it was a room with only European people, so that was a little bit strange, and it showed the limit of the dialogue, of course. So I think this is something we are asking, is to review the dialogue and reassess it and make it a more useful instrument. And Mr. Gilmore is taking over from Mr. Lambrinidis. Mr. Lambrinidis was the first special representative for human rights, and when he started his mandate, he went to Tibet in 2013 in his official capacity. ICT and others had the opportunity to brief him before he went there, and I think the meeting and his visit there was well prepared on his side. He had his arguments. He challenged Chinese position and policies on Tibet. But the main problem is the follow-up. When he came back, nothing really concrete came out of it. He had in mind to propose a cooperation between the EU and China on bilingual education, as some member states in the EU have good experience in that sector, and could be beneficial for China to respect Tibetan culture and language, but this was not implemented. So there is it's sort of more one visit, one shot event that is not really having any consequences. So this is a little bit to depict you the global perspective on the relation between EU and China. Now I will speak more about the division between EU member states, because that's a big challenge we have in EU on China, but also on many other issues, to speak with one voice. And I think Beijing is quite skillful in amplifying our division to divide and rule approach to apply for such approach in Europe. And the first, I think, example is this Belt and Road initiative that was also mentioned yesterday. It was an initiative launched by President Xi Jinping himself in 2013. There is today no specific list of countries, or no official compilation of the countries who signed an agreement with China. But according to Xinhua, 123 cooperation documents were signed with 105 countries. And there are different types of documents. There are memorandum of understanding, which are the strongest in terms of weight, political weight, and then joint declaration. It's not a legally binding document, it's more political documents. And from the EU, the following states have signed agreements with China. MOU with China is Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia in 2016, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the latest one was Italy in 2019. And Italy became the first G7 country to sign such an agreement with China, and this has created some tensions with some other member states in Europe, but also with the US, which were opposed to this agreement. And recently, China hosted a second forum for international cooperation in Beijing, end of April, and some heads of state and government attended from several countries, including Mr. Orban from Hungary, Mr. Kurz from Austria, Mr. Tsipras from Greece, and Mr. Conte from Italy. Countries who were more reluctant or in a defensive approach towards the war sent not head of states but lower level delegation, including the United States or Turkey. Interestingly, there has been a report by EU ambassador in Beijing in April last year who have been quite critical about the OBOR process, and they have criticized it. Not all 28 ambassadors, only 27, so I will point out the bad guys. It was here the Hungarian ambassador who decided not to sign it, and the primary critic that was reported in the Handelsblatt newspaper in Germany, it was saying that the OBOR runs counter to the EU agenda for liberalizing trade and pushes for the balance of power in favor of subsidized Chinese companies. So the position of the EU ambassador was not to ask to stop this OBOR process, but rather to rebalance it and to have it better, to have European interests better protected or represented in this process. Another factor of division example of division is this so-called 16+1 platform, which is the mostly Eastern European countries from the EU in dark red or outside the EU who cooperate with China. And recently, one additional country joined this group, and it was Greece. And you see Tsipras, the Prime Minister, on the right. So now this group should be called 17+1. And this last move is probably linked to the acquisition by Costco company of the controlling share of the Greek port of Piraeus and there are very obvious, economic connection between China and Greece since many years now. In this 16+1 cooperation, it's concerned different sectors, including infrastructure, and one interesting example of one project was the infrastructure railroad between Serbia, between Belgrade and Budapest, and China would like to have it built to bring goods in a faster way by train to Europe. But the problem is that the European Commission decided that the rules, EU rules in terms of market access and regulation were not respected, and they decided to block this project until these rules are respected. So we know that around 90% of the project of the Belt and Road Initiative have been implemented by Chinese companies, and that in the other way, China remains reluctant to have foreign investment in its country. So it's a very unbalanced relationship, and it's certainly not a two-way street. So this 17+1 platform is likely to remain a platform to compete for Chinese investment between these different countries. But I don't think it's much more than that. And I think we should not overestimate the political role and the weight of this platform. Another example of Chinese growing influence in Europe, which is bringing this division, also has been highlighted by an excellent report released last year by Merix. It's a Berlin-based institute, and it was an eye-opening report for many officials in Brussels and in European capitals, and it shows how far the Chinese influence in our society is already taking place in different sectors, not only in the political sector, but also in the academic sector, in universities, in the media sectors, and so on. And the report says that really we have to be vigilant in Europe and to protect in order to protect our values and interests. And we see that today China, in terms of political influence, traditionally it was reaching out to, political party, left, center, or right. And now it has extended its relation also to more extreme parties, populist party, but also extreme right parties as alternative for Germany, or anti-migrant nationalists like the Austrian Freedom Party and others. So they really think that, and it's the same tactic than Putin, it's to play on the card of the parties that will gain weight, and some of them have been already in the government in some country, and so they are really creating some network with such parties. And we also see that China have been quite active in before the EU campaign, or before the elections and during the EU campaign, and much more active towards the European Parliament and political parties in Europe. And one way China is also spreading its propaganda on Tibet and its ideas at the political level and academic level is by sending Tibet delegation abroad, and this goes also, it's true for the rest of the world, not only for Europe. And the last one we saw in Europe was in December 2018, a Tibetan delegation from the Chinese National People's Congress came to the European Parliament and then went to Denmark as well. And at the European Parliament, they had a meeting with different people and groups, and including one with Mr. Nirj Deva, who is a conservative UK representative. And he's also heading the EU-China Friendship Group. And the Friendship Group is it's an informal group, it's not a formal group. And Mr. Nirj Deva is going on a regular basis to China. And last time he went there, it was in November last year. And there were some articles by media reports saying that his economic class fare was upgraded by the Chinese side, and also all his hotel expenses and bills were covered. And once he was there, he had access to really high-level people that even for the EU delegation it's hard to meet with. So it's showing how there are some parallel diplomacy, and when Mr. Nirj Deva is in China, apparently he tends to represent or try to represent the European Parliament, and that's an issue for other MEPs because he has not mandate for that. And this brings me to another issue, which is the question of, this delegation access our countries without restrictions, as it is the case for journalists or for tourists. And the problem is that the opposite way is not true. This is why in the US the Reciprocal Act for Tibet was adopted. And we see now that slowly the issue is also coming in Europe. ICT had organized a conference on this issue in November last year in the European Parliament. And one important statement was made recently in April, again in the European Parliament, but by Mogherini, the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Policy, after the debate on the resolution on China and human rights that was adopted. And she said specifically, we have called on the Chinese authorities to allow reciprocal access to Tibet for European journalists, diplomats and families. So that's a significant statement that we will certainly follow up in the future. And one interesting also, and that's linked also to some sort of sanctions towards perpetrators of human rights violations abroad. There has been also discussion in Europe on the Magnitsky Act. Last year in November, the Dutch government asked the EU to consider adopting an EU Magnitsky Act in Europe as well, and this was supported by Germany. And in March this year, the European Parliament adopted a resolution saying, and I quote, that they should, adopt, the EU should, they call the EU to adopt an autonomous and flexible reactive EU-wide sanction regime that would allow for the targeting of any individual, state or non-state actors and other entities responsible for or involved in grave human rights violation. So that's a significant also move that we have to consider, keep in mind in Europe. Now there are discussions at the EU Council, but the problem is that implement such a principle, you need a unanimity decision between all member states, and it seems to be difficult, and in particular when it comes to sanctions, what kind of sanctions you can implement. So what we see on one way, so China is blocking or limiting access for our European citizens and representatives in China, but on the other way, they are also trying to block meetings of members of the Central Tibetan Administration or of His Holiness in Europe. And China has again mentioned an aggressive policy on this issue in its second policy paper on the EU, which was released in 2018. And you can really read on this sentence extracted from the report that their intentions are very clearly expressed. A last example I would like to show on this Chinese influence on our society. I wanted to speak about this, the consequence of this meeting, but it was already raised yesterday by Sikyong Lobsang Sangye. It was a meeting with the mayor of Prague. So the last point I want to raise on this issue is also the inserts by Chinese propaganda of articles of Chinese state media run into our newspapers. And this is taking place in several countries. So for instance, this is Le Soir, a Belgian newspaper that on a regular basis publishes such inserts. So we have, ICT has introduced a complaint toward the Council of Deontology of Journalism in Belgium, a sort of independent body. And our complaint was received, accepted on behalf of confusion between information and publicity. And so now we are waiting for the decision, which is a non-binding decision of this committee. Other countries also have such inserts, as in France we have Le Figaro, but also recently Le Monde published an insert, and this was just during the visit of Xi Jinping in France. Perhaps I would say in Germany there has been a pushback from the Süddeutsche Zeitung reverse its position. It used to publish some such articles and then decided to stop. It was not officially announced, but we guess it's a decision. And so it shows that there can be some changes of attitude, and it's important for us to be active on this ground. I forgot to mention when I was speaking about Greece at the beginning, it's that Greece also blocked an EU statement at the Council on Human Rights in June 2018. And it's the first time that that the EU did not deliver a statement on behalf of the 28. So I will, the new developments that we see in Europe, and I will be fast, is that indeed since the Huawei discussion that is happening over the world, we've seen that there is now discussion also in Europe about the need to protect our strategic assets vis-à-vis, spying activities or security issues from foreign countries. There are now discussions at the EU level, but also in national capitals in several countries about this situation. And the European Commission has recently released a document, a report, which was then adopted by the Council, which clearly says that China is not only depicted now as a partner, but also as a systematic rival promoting alternative models of governance. And this is new wording that we see. It was not used in the past. MEP Joe Leinen, who is heading the EU-China delegation, which is officially body of the European Parliament, said, I quote, "From a friendly partner in a few years, China changed to an unfriendly competitor. And China has lost the battle in the US and is on the way to losing the battle in Europe," he said. So we feel that there is some change of attitude in Europe, and some heads of states think we have to give a more united image towards China. There have been one example on this. It was when Xi Jinping was in France recently. President Macron received him, and he asked Chancellor Merkel and Juncker President of the European Commission, to join him and to show that the two main European bigger states and the European Commission are together when receiving Xi Jinping. But then Xi Jinping just after that went to Monaco, where he signed an agreement on the 5G and Huawei with the state of Monaco. I will conclude by saying that there is a growing awareness about increased China influence in Europe and the risk it can represent for our EU interest. And recently Germany domestic intelligence agency has, for instance, warned of Chinese attempts to infiltrate political and business circles through LinkedIn. And in February this year, Lithuanian intelligence services are reported to have accused China of recruiting its citizens to engage in espionage activities and influence public opinion on issues such as Tibet and Taiwan. So I think there is a sort of evolution of the political context in Europe. There is not a 180-degree shift on all issues, in particular when it comes to sensitive issues as Tibet, as Hong Kong, Taiwan, or human rights. There is a lot of room for maneuvers there and improvement to be made. But I think this context is quite interesting, and we should use it, and we will try to use it the best way we can to ask the EU to put human rights at the center of its relation with China and to have a more balanced relation with China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. It was very informative and I think very useful for the continuation of the debate. So we have now 20 minutes for discussion, questions, debate, and so I think we had a lot of information, and I'm very happy to see already one hand going up. Our friend from Canada, Consiglio di Nino.
Following Mr. Gershman's comments, it reminded me of a couple of things. One is that only yesterday I discovered that Lodi Gary had passed away, which I was saddened to hear. But George Fernandez was the originator of World Parliamentarian Conferences. The first, he chaired and hosted the first one in Delhi, which I attended. That doesn't necessarily show my age, does it? A little seed was planted during Mr. Gershman's comments, and I wonder if we could consider this for discussion. I think we should create some sort of a permanent recognition of the partnership of these two gentlemen under the auspices of our organization, that we could honor them basically in perpetuity for their contribution, which has resulted in this and the many other conferences that we've had under this umbrella. It's just a thought that I'm thinking, and I'd like to ask my friends to think along this as well, and maybe between now and the next few months we can create some opportunity to permanently together recognize this duo who has been incredibly supportive. I met Mr. Fernandez in India, but also has family in Canada, and I met him twice in Canada as well. And just a quick comment to Mr. Gershman. Yes, Canada did pass the Magnitsky Law, if you didn't know. And the other thought that I would express in this whole discussion is, I still think that there has to be some opportunity for us to engage in the dialogue, not just the states, but the Chinese diaspora around the world, because I think there is a willingness there to learn. They came from China to the West and other parts for a reason, and I think that they could be partners in disseminating the message that we're trying to send across the world. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Consiglio, for your comment. I'm sure that the leadership of the Tibetan Parliament will consider also your proposal and come up with some ideas for that. If there are other questions or comments, yes, there is one. Our friend from the UK.
I just wanted to take up a small point that Mr. Jonathan Staber has made, or one of the ideas that is put forward to the conference is to make clear and successive declaration of the reincarnation position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So maybe this conference could adopt a line or a couple of lines to this effect, and then the other parliamentarians can take it over in national parliaments. That would be something I want to suggest. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually we have also some of our colleagues who are preparing the draft for the declaration, so I'm sure that this will be taken note of, as there is certainly wide consensus. If there are no other questions, I would like to just make a comment and actually expand just a little bit more on the question of reciprocity. As you know, it has been said, there was this breakthrough in the United States last year, but I just wanted to give you also a little bit what is the philosophical approach behind this and why I think there is some space to make progress. Basically, through the angle of reciprocity, what we have been trying to do is to portray the issue of Tibet also as a domestic issue for countries. For many years, for decades, Tibet has only been seen as a foreign policy issue, as a human rights issue, as a democracy promotion issue, and conflict resolution, which is still true. That doesn't change. But through the angle of reciprocity, actually, with the growing understanding that there is an imbalanced relationship and undue and unfair pressure from China in our own societies, in our countries, we have started to realize that there are actual discriminations that are perpetrated against EU and American citizens. This has been very clear on trade issues. The lack of reciprocity is now at the center of one of the biggest political issues between the United States and China. As the United States has decided to challenge the trade deficit that has been going on for many years. There has been also growing concern in European countries, in particular in Germany, in France. Both Sarkozy and Merkel have used the word reciprocity as part of fundamental principles of EU and bilateral relations with China. So the idea is to try to expand this concept also to some of the civil liberties that are part of our way of living that are not applied in China. And so the question of access to Tibet came into this picture because it's a clear limitation of freedom of movement for European or American citizens to go to Tibet, as Chinese citizens have wide access to our countries. But beyond that, actually, there are also the issues of freedom of information. You have just heard from Vincent about the publications in the newspapers, but you know that Xinhua and other state media in China are expanding their network of televisions and state agencies in, I think there are over 10 languages already distributed all over the world. There is no access for foreign media to the Chinese market. It's a question of access to the market, but it's a question of freedom of information that can be raised as a domestic issue, as an issue that it's in the interest of our own countries to put forward. And another one is the academic freedom issue. We have been talking about the Confucius Institute, and there has been quite a bit of campaigning around that to raise awareness about the propaganda that is spread in our universities through the Confucius Institute. But the other angle is there is no access for US, European, or universities that put forward academic freedom to China. If you have a cooperation among universities, you are not allowed, if you're a professor, to talk about Tibet in a university in China or to talk about human rights. So I think this is, I think in a moment that there is this growing rise of China globally, it is also creating a reaction because there is, fear of this growing influence. And I think the question of reciprocity, it's a complementary way to try to raise, civil rights and, human rights issues in dealing with China. And specifically with Tibet, I think we have a lot to say. As we know, Tibet is one of the most restricted spaces and regions in the world. So I just wanted to give that as an additional way to present the issue. And I think, from many members of Parliament here, I would like also to hear from you if you have any comments or if you think that this is a good way to put forward. Card, shall we get it from there? Maybe, Tim. Yes.
Thank you, Matteo. We were talking yesterday about the environmental issues and the sustainability impact on Tibet. In tandem with the human rights argument, again, as a way of getting a wider voice and a wider understanding amongst people, is there a way that we could identify products that are being produced because of unsustainable mining and other extraction from Tibet, and really do a sort of name and shame that if you are buying this product, you are supporting environmental damage in Tibet because of the lithium or whatever it may be. I'm not in tariff wars and trade wars are all the rage at the moment. I'm not in favor of that, but actually it's a very powerful way of raising attention to certain products that come from places that we wouldn't necessarily want to buy them. And I just wonder if some work could be done through our friends in various academic institutes or in Dharamsala or whatever to identify those products that are widely on sale in the Western markets that come from Tibet and are not sustainable.
Thank you, that's a very good point. Let's go on also with, there are a few others, so we'll take those questions at the end. Michael, and then our friend from the French Senate who just arrived this morning.
Sorry, but I must speak in my own language because you will not understand what I want to say. But there is a translator, I suppose. Ce que je voulais dire plusieurs choses, j'ai plusieurs commentaires en fait à tout ce qui a été dit ce matin et être en écho d'ailleurs avec certaines interventions de collègues dans la salle. Oui, il a été longuement expliqué et avec beaucoup d'expertise les difficultés que connaît le gouvernement chinois pour maintenir l'ordre et son autorité à l'intérieur du pays, mais également à l'extérieur. On a expliqué quelle était la politique colonialiste, il faut bien le dire, de la Chine. Et on peut se rassurer en se disant que l'histoire nous montre que toutes les civilisations sont mortelles et l'Empire chinois lui aussi est également à terme. En attendant, il faut bien sûr agir. Je suis personnellement très fière en tant que présidente du groupe d'amitié France-Tibet de l'Assemblée nationale. Je suis venue accompagnée du vice-président Olivier Damézin qui est à mes côtés pour porter la parole de mes collègues députés français. Je suis particulièrement heureuse de la prise de position du président Macron, accompagnée, confirmée par celle de la chancelière Merkel. Et j'espère que les résultats de l'Europe vont nous permettre justement de mener une politique européenne en faveur du Tibet qui soit un peu plus officielle. Indépendamment du fait qu'il y a cette dimension respect des droits de l'homme et que la France est le pays par excellence de son histoire, le pays des droits de l'homme, et qu'il convient de rappeler qu'il y a cette exigence de respect de l'être humain, il n'empêche qu'effectivement les Chinois sont très sensibles à la dimension économique. Comme nous le sommes tous d'ailleurs. Même il y a la réelle politique qui à un moment ou un autre rappelle les plus belles déclarations humanitaires que peuvent faire les présidents de pays. Je pense qu'effectivement, ce qui vient d'être dit par un intervenant sur l'impact que pourraient avoir les démarches de name and shame. On a vu que certaines grandes entreprises à l'échelle internationale avaient dû rendre des comptes à l'opinion publique sur les conditions, par exemple, de production de certains produits importés et développés à l'échelle internationale. Pourquoi ne pas essayer d'explorer cette piste? Et effectivement, comme je vois notamment en France, que l'opinion publique est très sensibilisée à la qualité de la fabrication des produits et des soi-disant produits bio qui viennent pour certains en grande partie de la Chine et qui ne correspondent à aucune norme environnementale et bio et de responsabilité sociale de l'entreprise. On pourrait peut-être jouer cette carte qui, me semble-t-il, est un bon levier économique et nous permettre peut-être de faire pression à un niveau économique sur lequel nous ne sommes pas pour le moment dans un vrai rapport de force qui nous serait favorable. Ça, c'est une première piste. Et la deuxième piste, de la même manière que l'opinion publique internationale est très inquiète des problèmes de réchauffement climatique et des problèmes d'environnement, là aussi, à mon avis, il y a une piste à suivre pour demander à aller vérifier ce qui se passe sur le plateau tibétain, où se trouve la plus grande réserve d'eau du continent indien. Et cela mérite, comme on sait, que les problèmes environnementaux ne peuvent pas être simplement abordés à une échelle nationale, que ce sont des questions réellement internationales, que nous sommes tous concernés par ce qui se passe à l'autre bout de la planète. Donc là aussi, nous pourrions essayer de voir si on ne peut pas jouer la chaîne internationale des associations environnementales pour exiger des comptes de la part de la Chine et aller voir sur place ce qui s'y passe au-delà des problèmes de gouvernance politique de la Chine. Voilà, c'était quelques pistes de réflexion. Merci de m'avoir écouté.
Merci. And Vincent will summarize because not everybody had a headset. So
I will just translate the two recommendations that was proposed by Mrs. Tutupika. It was she represents the French intergroup at the French Parliament, the Assembly. The first one is indeed it's to echo the first remark. It is our public opinion are very sensitive now to the quality of products and the origin of products. So it would be important to try to play this card and to try to identify also where the products come from, including from China and from Tibet, and this could be used as an economic leverage. And the second point that you recommend, it's really to, as our public opinion are very now sensitive to global warming, she would like to propose that a mission, fact-finding mission would be also sent to Tibet to check what's the reality there in Tibet, which is the third pole and the roof of the world, and asked the Chinese to some report information also about this issue, and that they should be made accountable for what's happening there, partly also. So that's the two main recommendations that she proposed.
yes, thank you. And also, if the headset can be distributed in the room, that would be helpful if someone else is going to speak. Yes. Yes, we have Michael and then Yodon.
Just a point in response to our question from the French Senate. Yesterday we had very extensive discussions in the last session about why practically every delegation here can't go to Tibet. So it's not a problem that we haven't thought of, but it's a very valid idea that we all keep trying to do it. So my question is to our Hungarian-Romanian delegate and to Mr. Gershman. Both of you have said that in Europe and in the United States the cause of Tibet and the Dalai Lama is stronger than it was 20 years ago. I think that's, after listening to people yesterday, that's undeniably true. But also over the last 20 years, China is unbelievably stronger economically, militarily, and in their Comintern activities all around the world, their political influence operations. So are we going to reach some point at which the parliamentary and popular support for Tibet is going to negate the many government people who are looking, if they're in the developed world, for the Belt and Road debt trap scenarios, or in the developed world for the alleged economic advantages for their societies and personally.
Okay, we'll take the last one, Yudon, and then we'll give the floor to some of the panelists to respond and wrap up.
I have a few questions based on Vincent's presentation. If there is already this realization that there is asymmetric political relationship between China and the European countries, why don't they insist on this principle of reciprocity and fairness in trade and in, like according to the Marketer Institute for China Studies, they're saying that China restricts access of foreign ideas, actors and capital. So can we not insist on that? Can the European countries not, or are they already doing it? I just wanted to know. Secondly, I think, Vincent, you were talking about how even in the European countries, Chinese government, it's all government, the press is owned by the government. They insert Chinese propaganda in the local newspapers. And we have similar problem in India and Nepal and in South Asia. So I don't know if that's illegal. I'm just asking, is that illegal? No. And how do you counter that? Because we have similar problems and we have not been able to do much about it.
Okay, great questions. Carl, you had something to say at the beginning? Then we'll go.
I can go, if you're taking comments from everybody, I can speak at the end.
Yeah, okay. So maybe Vincent, you want to respond first, and then we go this way, okay?
Thank you. Yes, reciprocity is already a discussed issue for some time now, and by different EU leaders, including President Macron or Chancellor Merkel, when they meet their Chinese interlocutor. But when it's raised, it's mainly reciprocity concerns trade relations and economic relations. And there is a feeling in Europe that it's very unbalanced, and that the Chinese sponsored companies are, not respecting the rules of international rules of trade. And so they're really complaining about that, and they say it must be rebalanced. But so when they speak now, when they use the term reciprocity, until recently it was mainly to describe this trade unbalanced relationship. And what we are trying at ICT and other is to extend the concept of reciprocity to other sectors as well, to access to territories, to freedom of press, and so on. So I think this extension of the concept needs sometimes to be, understood and then integrated and then implemented. The inserts of such ads are, publicity ads are not illegal at all. We know newspapers are in a financial difficult situation. They are struggling to get funds and money. And so that's a way, I think. We don't know how, the thing is that there is no transparent information about what kind of deal is made between the newspaper and the two newspapers and two media. So that's maybe a way you can ask, is to provide information about the terms of reference. What's the deal? What's the deal? How much do you get from Chinese? What's the regularity of the inserts? For how long will it go on? And so on. And I think when we write to, when Le Monde published recently again this ads, for the first time this ads during Xi Jinping visit, we wrote with other NGOs to the head of the editorial section of Le Monde, saying that we are very much concerned because we think that it's creating some confusion by the reader, because it's noted it's publicity, but it's not in a very big letters, and the article speak about some actuality also issues and so on. So if you are a little bit naive, you could think that maybe this is some sort of reality. And that it's a question for us of ethic. ethic. You have Le Monde is a very good newspaper with journalists that are, really trying to get objective information or to write strong stories about China and get testimonies, and then they produce quality articles. And I'm sure that these journalists, when they see these inserts, they must be also very unhappy. So I think that it's a question of line. How far, what is your line in terms of editorial content? What kind of information do you accept? Would you accept tomorrow if North Korea comes with, advertisement to promote its nuclear project? Yes, no, why? What's the limit? Would you accept that Iran comes also and speaks about nuclear activities and says we want to amplify it and to have military nuclear capabilities in the future? I don't think the newspaper would accept that, and I'm sure that there will be strong, political pressure on this newspaper. So, if Saudi Arabia would promote the death penalty, would you accept that? I mean, I think the red line has to be drawn in some way of on what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and what criteria should be made. That's why in Brussels, in Belgium, we ask for this. Sorry, I'm passionate about this this topic. So that's some ideas that we can further discuss this later on.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Saba, yes.
So back to the question. Yesterday we mentioned there is a difference between the ministers and prime ministers who see in China an economic possibility, yes, and the parliamentarians. So the answer is that after the European elections, I hope that the Tibet Intergroup will be reestablished, and then we can start, or those who will be there, they can start to fight with our own ghosts. First of all, our colleagues who are thinking and planning just on an economical level, and to raise awareness and sensibility towards human rights and minority rights. Some members of the European Parliament are just indifferent. They have no sensitivity of minority rights. Even my own colleagues from Romania, I mentioned in my speech, why you need that language, why you need that religion, why you want to keep your culture, because now it's universal. And then, of course, we have the duty to fight with our own governments, own national parliaments, and maybe try to establish also a Tibet Friendship Group at home, which is, I mentioned the day before, it's quite difficult in very pro-China countries like Romania. But that's the only thing what we can do, and of course to push our national parliaments and governments to give a good example for China, not a bad one. I didn't mention in my speech, but on minority rights, there are some countries who are treating their traditional minorities very badly, like Greece, France, I'm sorry, Romania, Slovakia, Lithuania, Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, Turkish minority.
We can't open the debate.
But
European
follow
minority.
the good ones, Italy or Finland. And that's the way how we can start something with our colleagues, to mention them the good examples.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, but we are really running out of time. Jonathan?
Sure, I'll be brief. On the role of private companies in China and on the environment in particular, private companies, I think you all probably know this, are becoming so much more sensitive to their image. I don't think there's a website you can go to any major corporation and not see a 15 to 20 page pamphlet about their commitment to human rights and the environment and all these kind of social good. And there's really a movement in corporate America and multinational corporations around the world on that imaging. And I think consumers all over the world are more interested in buying products and from companies that do those sorts of things. And so this is a great opportunity for those of us who work on the human rights and on the environment side to really make a difference here, because those companies have so much power. And so many of them have these supply chains within China and other places around the world where they're using forced labor, prison labor. They're not, their supply chains don't have good safeguards on the environment or social safeguards. And fortunately, there is some good reporting out there, and we are getting a lot of information on this sort of thing. Or their end products may contribute to surveillance. We're seeing that a lot in Xinjiang. Biotech, genetics, imaging. There's all these very high-tech things that are going on right now that corporations around the world are perhaps unwittingly in some cases, or even naively in other cases, contributing to the human rights situation in China and Tibet that we're so concerned about. So first, shine the light. I think that can make a huge difference because the companies, they care about their consumers and their profit margins more than almost anything. And we also have to talk about possible export controls. And that's a more detailed conversation. And in the US Congress, we are thinking about those sorts of things. And hopefully we'll have some plans moving forward soon. So that's the one thing. And on the role of information. In terms of these state-run, China, state-run newspapers, you see these inserts in the Washington Post in the US. Obviously, you see the Confucius Institutes, the roles in colleges and universities worldwide. I served on a group over the last couple of years before this job where we made a recommendation to the US Congress that state-run newspapers in China, that when they are doing their reporting here, in reporting in the United States, that they register as foreign agents. And they do all sorts of things in terms of labeling their reporting, quote unquote, as what it is. It's propaganda. And in many cases, it's a foreign government trying to influence the people of a country and a government to pursue certain policies. That's propaganda. That's not only a human rights issue, it's a national security issue. And I think in Washington, there's really some serious thinking about, this. It's not journalism. It's not free information. It's not. It's a government. It's propaganda. And certainly registering as a foreign agent, I've always thought was a good first step on that front.
Carl, and then we close.
Okay, thank you. On that point, we developed this concept of sharp power, yes, which really overrides all of this. And to distinguish what China does from soft power in the West, which is very manipulative, very penetrating, seeks to divide and manipulate societies. And we have to look at the whole picture. And in that regard, I just want to say that I think we're in a period of transition in attitudes toward China. It may be a little bit further along in the United States. The Economist magazine a year ago said that there has been, at the beginning of last year, the sharpest geopolitical reversal in modern history has taken place in attitudes toward China. The West's 25-year bet on China has failed, they said, because the idea was that you bring China into the global economy, they'll become a more liberal society, and hasn't worked that way. I was very struck by the statements in Vincent's report, one of which from the the Mercator Institute, that criticizing what it called fits of preemptive obedience to curry favor with Beijing. And I think we're beginning to see an awakening there in some circles. And then also, I was very impressed by the statement from the European Commission that China is a systematic rival promoting alternative models of governance. And Xi Jinping, I think you'll remember, at the 19th Party Congress in October 1917, said that China represented a new option for the world. It just wasn't an economic, competitor or power. It represented a different model. So I think the way we need to think about this problem, the broad way to integrate everything we're talking about, is we are engaged in a battle of ideas. And we have to fight that battle of ideas, and we have to understand that everything that we're fighting for here, the lies regarding Tibet and the propaganda we are engaged in a battle of ideas against a totalitarian country that represents an alternative model to democracy. People have difficulty thinking about that because they think that all that passed with the end of the Cold War, but it didn't pass. One final, and let me just mention there, document number 9. Don't forget document number 9 that was approved by the Chinese Central Committee in 2013, basically saying we cannot permit ideas of constitutionality, free media, we cannot permit those ideas to enter into China. that issue has been raised by China just as the issue of history has been raised by China. A final point on George and Lodi. I think it's a wonderful proposal that was made by Consiglio. The one thing I would add to that is keep India at the center of your consciousness with that, if we can. Get India's involvement in that, because nothing that what Lodi taught me was, take India's democracy, cherish it, take it very, very seriously. And in fact, as we think about the future of China, really nothing is more important than the success of the Indian democracy next door. And if we can figure out a way of doing what you're talking about, which I think is a wonderful way of talking about these ideas by honoring Lodi and George, if we can get India's buy-in to that in a significant way, I think it would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We ran out of time, and we'll now call on the MC for a brief announcement.
Yes. I need 2 minutes because some of our delegates are leaving just after the session. So on behalf of the organizer, we would like to honor some of the members who are leaving after this session. I would like to request our speaker, Pema Jungnela, to honor souvenir and scarf, our old friend and the great friend of the Gary Rinpoche and George Fernandes. I was able to meet with the college in 1999. The first World National Endowment Democracy Convention was organized in Lee Meridian and Delhi. The last, I think, 20 years back, I was able to meet through the Gary Rinpoche and through the George Fernandes. So may I request to a speaker kindly to honor a souvenir and a scarf. And then I also request to our Dr. Lobsang Singhi, the Sekyong, next to honor the Czech, the member of the parliament. Mr. Friedrich, Dr. Lobsang Singla, please, our Czech member of the parliament, Friedrich. Concord Friedrich. Yeah, please. Yeah. And then next, the Butila is also living. So we would like to. I will request to our former speaker, the Minister of the Education, Honorable Thupten Lungdila, please to honor the Butila. Butila. Ale. And then I will request Pamela is also living, so Honorable the Thupten Lungdila will honor the Pema Tolo Changa, please. Then I will request our former speaker, Venerable. Yeah, please, Pamela. And I will also request to Pamela Runa. I will request to please Pamela, come. Marakasa Pudila, sorry. And former speaker Venerable Sonam Tembela to honor our UK Parliament, both are living UK Parliament. Tim, please. And then the Chryslo. So all of our members are leaving today after this session and after the late session. So, and the rest of our dignitaries and delegates we will honor tonight. And we have an announcement. Wait for the few, I think, announcement we'll do by.
Good morning, everybody. First, bienvenue à mes compatriotes français. And now we will have a photo session, so please put the perfume, arrange yourself, and let's go. And big smile, huh?
On the stage.
On the stage, please, on the stage.
Yes, come on the stage.
How are you? Good, good. You?
Obvykle by až přinosívám.
Chop square. It's every Friday. I never see one and I don't want to see one.
Standing up here?
Are we standing up here or down here?
Stand up.